So far, I'm loving this book. The protagonist is compelling, the plot is intriguing, and the setting is immersive and vibrant. But then, as I'm reading, I come across a passage that just totally disrupts the entire experience. Now, I'm not even sure if I want to keep reading the story. This is the reading experience you want to avoid at all costs. But there's one extremely common mistake that can lead to readers DNFing your book. It's something you probably think that you're successfully avoiding, but you might not actually be. It's info dumping. I'm going to walk through the 4 ways that info dumping is probably creeping into your manuscript without you even realizing it, and talk through how to fix it with real examples. You're going to walk away from this video with an eagle eye for info dumping, so you can turn back to your manuscript and get rid of all of those passages that might lead a reader to DNF. And make sure you stick all the way through to the end, because the last info dumping mechanism is one of the hardest to spot. First, let's lay the groundwork. Why is info dumping so bad? Why is it one of the mistakes that leads me personally to put a book down? Info dumping by design is when you are pausing or halting the action of the scene to provide the reader what you feel is necessary background, context, or exposition. And it becomes a dump when you're diving into this exposition or backstory for a prolonged period of time, typically a paragraph or more. You're doing this because you want to orient the reader in your novel's world, but you end up overwhelming them with information all at once and leading them to disengage with the story. Here's why info dumping just doesn't work. First, it doesn't actually allow the reader to latch on the information that you are trying to give them, because they're naturally going to skim over it and not digest what you are trying to tell them. Their eyes may even glaze over it in particularly lengthy passages. It also slows down your narrative momentum and gets in the way of your hook. Info dumping often happens in the first chapters or scenes of your book, because this is when you are trying to catch the reader up to speed on all the rules and regulations of your world. But this is also the most dangerous time to info dump, because the reader's engagement is fickle and at any point they could put your book down. So if a big info dump happens early on in the story, you might lose that reader. And finally, info dumping can strike the reader as just frankly weak writing, and it could erode their trust in you as the storyteller. Now, I am not saying you should never provide exposition or backstory. In fact, these are 2 critical elements to every successful story. And you need to provide some amount of exposition and backstory to help the reader get immersed in your character's circumstances and environment. I did a whole separate video on why exposition is misunderstood, so I will link that in the description for more. I'm not trying to scare you away from providing exposition, but I want you to provide exposition without info dumping. That is the key difference here. So now let's go through the 4 key ways that info dumping creeps into your story without you even realizing it. First is in prologues or prefaces. This mechanism of info dumping is especially prevalent in sci-fi or fantasy novels, where you want to lay the groundwork for the history surrounding your novel's world and get the reader caught up on all of it before the plot even begins. Often, this prologue or preface passage will not be attached to your main POV character, but come from a more omniscient tone. Let's look at an example. Pause this video to read. Do you see how this is operating as an info dump, just giving us a ton of information about how this world came to be and the situation that the characters are presently in? It would be so much more effective for us to learn about this world's history and these specific details as we see the characters take action. Beginning the story with a passage like this just frankly isn't that engaging, because we have no specific character to latch onto. We have no sense of what the main conflict of the novel is actually going to be. So I instead recommend getting us right into the heart of the story and weaving in these pieces of information as they become relevant. I'm not saying here that prologues are always off limits. There are valid reasons for including prologues, but info dumping is not one of them. Here's the next way info dumping creeps into your story: via lengthy expository passages. Look out in your manuscript for paragraphs or sections of text that don't actually materially progress the plot forward, but are really just standing to provide background information. These types of passages are especially common in your opening scenes because, again, you're trying to lay the groundwork for the reader. But remember that you don't need to tell us everything about this world all at once and all up front in the story. It's okay for readers to learn things as we go and as the story's action progresses. A trick I like to use is looking for passages that can stand alone, meaning that a reader could interpret them completely separate from the book and the story you're trying to tell. If they can understand the passage without the context of the scene that it is situated within, then that's a sign you're probably info dumping here. Like I mentioned with the prologue or preface issue, often these passages will adopt a more omniscient tone detached from the POV character that you have established. Basically, what you're doing here is halting the flow and action of the scene to then provide a bunch of background details before restarting the action again, which disrupts the reader's experience and severs our connection from our POV character. So let's look at an example. Again, pause this video to read. So here we see the scene of Amy putting away her notebook and then realizing she needs to go to the depot. And then there's a huge pause where we get this passage describing what the depot is. Again, we are severing the connection from Amy's POV and we adopt a more omniscient tone to receive this information. Instead, that exposition should be filtered through Amy's particular experience and blended into the scene action more organically. So let's look at how this could be revised. Again, pause this video to read. Do you see how we're getting the exact same information in this passage, but it feels so much more organic to the story and keeps us engaged? We learn about the infestation of rats, about the different rations based on a person's ranking in the city, and we learn what those rations are. But instead of an omniscient narrator just giving us all of that information, we're learning about it through this brief memory that Amy recalls. You're still pausing the scene action briefly to give us this information, but because we're still attached to Amy, it feels so much more warranted and it flows much more naturally. If you're finding this video helpful so far, give me a thumbs up to let me know. It really helps out my channel, and consider subscribing if you haven't yet. Every week, I give writing advice like today's video, or I talk about the book publishing industry since that is my professional background. I'd love to have you join us. Okay, this next one is probably my least favorite instance of info dumping. It happens via unnatural dialogue. You might think it's impossible to info dump via dialogue, but this is actually one of the most common places that you will find info dumping in your story. And these can be some of the most distracting and pesky instances of info dumps. This happens when characters engage in unrealistic or stilted conversations that are relaying information for the reader's benefit, rather than something they would be talking about of their own accord. They're bringing up things that they both already know, but because the reader doesn't know them, we are seeing them talk about it aloud, which just ends up feeling totally unrealistic. Let's look at an example. Again, pause this video to read. Does this dialogue strike you as natural? It feels a bit unbelievable, right? Because obviously Jeremy and Amy already understand the circumstances of their world and the history that has informed their present situation. So rehashing it in this way just feels totally inorganic. And the reader immediately understands that the writer put this here for our own benefit. There are ways to effectively relay expository information via dialogue, but you want to do so while maintaining the integrity of those conversations and ensuring that they sound realistic. Consider reading your dialogue aloud to make sure that it sounds natural to how these characters and real people would speak. And make sure your dialogue is serving a purpose other than providing the reader this information. It should either be developing the characters' relationships or advancing the plot in some way. Here's an example of how we might revise the previous passage. Again, pause this video to read. Do you see how we get a lot of the same information about the blackouts and the rations from the previous passage, but this is a much more interesting and engaging conversation? There's also a plot development here because we see the discovery of this photo and Amy's recognition of the man, which will presumably come back into the story in some way. Overall, this dialogue sounds much more true to how these two characters would interact. The final way info dumping creeps into your manuscript is via forced character reflections. Showing moments of narrative reflection is critical to helping the reader understand what your characters are thinking and feeling. This is what's known as their interiority, and it is critical to successful, effective fiction. But sometimes writers will use characters' reflections as a means of info dumping, which again feels disruptive to the flow of the story and stands out as unnatural. Similar to the previous point about info dumping via dialogue, make sure that your characters' reflections are true to what they would actually be thinking about in that moment, and that information is not just being conveyed for the reader's benefit. It should advance our understanding of that character or advance the plot in some way. Here's an example. Again, pause this video to read. During the scene of Amy walking through the ruins, we're hit with these reflections that she's having about her broader society, which don't necessarily feel that natural. The text itself reads almost more like a history book than a person's internal train of thought. Instead, we want to make sure that those reflections are actually pertinent to what that character is thinking about and feeling in that given moment, and that their reflections relate to the scene action that we're seeing. Let's look at a revised passage. Again, pause this video to read. Do you see how Amy's reflections in this revised passage are much more tied to the exact moment that she is experiencing in the scene? We're still given the same information about drones issuing tickets, but it comes much more naturally through what Amy would be thinking about in that moment, rather than adopting a textbook-like or academic tone to give us a broad scope view of the world's history. Now you have all the tools you need to go back through your manuscript and catch those pesky info dumps. Let me know in the comments if you find one. If you're looking for more ways to strengthen your story from the inside out, check out my free story self-assessment worksheet. The link is in the description below. It is a quiz I designed to help you look at your story with fresh eyes and identify those weak spots in it that you might be blind to. Downloading that's also going to opt you into my newsletter, Chapter Break, where I'm dishing out exclusive interviews with literary agents and best-selling authors. They're giving amazing publishing and writing advice. The link to check out Chapter Break is also in the description. Before you head out, give me a thumbs up if you liked today's video, and subscribe so you don't miss out on my next one. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.